and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Kahn. Thank you very much for listening, as always. This is part 3 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled Winter of Discontent. Once again, I do not believe I have anything to say at the top of the show by way of housekeeping, so let's just begin. In the previous episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, we followed our protagonist as he embarked on the first stage of his American Odyssey. Accompanied by a handful of other military officers of French origin, Lafayette left for America in April 1777 aboard a merchant vessel that he had purchased. This ship, which had been rechristened as La Victoire, reached its destination, the port of Charleston, South Carolina, on June 12th. Upon coming ashore, Lafayette and company took some time to get their bearings before beginning the long overland journey to Philadelphia, where they would accept their commissions from the Continental Congress. Arriving in the de jure capital of the nascent United States in the final days of July, they were received rather coldly by the Americans. Lafayette and company had been preceded by scores of other French officers looking to be granted commissions in the Continental Army. These men often asked to be given ranks and compensation that were disproportionate to their experience. Their less than pleasant dealings with the American political and military leadership had given them a reputation as being little better than mercenaries, and Congress was not at all inclined to grant any more officers' commissions to foreigners. Lafayette, however, was determined to prove that he was not just another one of these soldiers of fortune, so he offered to serve without a commission, meaning that he would receive no official salary and pay all of his own expenses. This gesture, along with letters from their envoys in Paris attesting to the young Marquis's genuine intentions and connections at Versailles, convinced Congress to change their mind, and they officially made the Marquis a major general in the Continental Army on July 31st, 1777. The American diplomats and statesmen who advocated on his behalf explained that Lafayette need not be entrusted with the same responsibilities that would befit his rank. They expected that he would serve for only a short time in a ceremonial capacity before returning to France. Lafayette, however, saw things differently. He was determined to lead troops in the field and live up to his family's reputation. The day after accepting his appointment, Lafayette had the opportunity to meet with the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, under whom he would serve, George Washington. Lafayette idolized the man from the very moment onward, while Washington remained wary of the exuberant, fresh-faced young aristocrat, though he would grow to trust him in time. It was not long before Lafayette would have the chance to experience combat firsthand. On September 11th, American forces under General Washington encountered the British Army at Chad's Ford, some 25 miles or so southwest of Philadelphia. In the ensuing battle, the Americans were outflanked and their lines began to waver. Lafayette, who had been pestering Washington for the past several days to be allowed to command troops in battle, was finally granted his request. He rode out into the thick of the action, trying for some time to rally the troops to little avail, before being struck in the leg with a musket ball. When the order was given to retreat, Lafayette did his best to ensure that the men were able to withdraw in some semblance of order, despite the fact that he was growing weak from the loss of blood. This battle, the Battle of Brandywine, was a catastrophic defeat for the Americans, but, in a sense, it can be considered a victory for Lafayette. News of his heroic exploits during the battle fascinated audiences in both America and in France. Ultimately, his leg wound, which was not in any way life-threatening, had done him more good than harm, though the wound did require him to remain bedridden for a period of about 2 months, much to his annoyance. Lafayette returned to active duty in late November. During this time, he volunteered to assist General Nathaniel Greene on a reconnaissance mission in New Jersey. On November 25th, he had the opportunity to lead troops in battle once again. At the head of 400 militia, Lafayette led a raid on an outpost of Hessian mercenaries in the employ of the British at Gloucester, New Jersey. He and his men inflicted 20 casualties on them and took as many captive. His actions during the Battle of Gloucester, as well as earlier at Brandywine, had convinced Washington to reconsider his hard and fast stance against granting military commands to foreign nationals. Lafayette had thoroughly impressed the commander-in-chief, and finally convinced him to give the Marquis command of his own regiment. Meanwhile, General Washington had made the decision to set up camp for the winter. Instead of risking an attack to reclaim the American capital of Philadelphia, which had been captured by the British following their victory at Brandywine. The site that Washington chose for the Army's winter encampment was a wooded plateau northwest of the city called Valley Forge. As the first snows began to fall, the Americans constructed small wooden huts that Lafayette later described as being about as pleasant as dungeon cells. Each of these huts could house up to 12 men, but Lafayette was allowed one all to himself on account of his rank. The winter at Valley Forge has since become infamous for the privations suffered by the men encamped there. Washington struggled to provide sufficient food, clothing, and other necessities for the army. Quite a few officers blamed Washington for the Army's supply troubles. Washington, in turn, blamed Congress. Later, recalling the miserable conditions at the encampment, Lafayette stated, quote, "Our position was untenable. The soldiers lived in misery. They lacked clothes, hats, shirts, shoes. Their legs and feet were black from frostbite. We often had to amputate limbs. The army often went whole days without provisions, and the patient endurance of the soldiers and officers was a miracle, which each moment served to renew. Their misery prevented new enlistments. It was impossible to recruit." End quote. Still, even in such dire straits, Lafayette did not entirely lose his characteristic sense of optimism. Quote, "The sacred fire of liberty burned on, however, which is why the strength of that army never ceased being a mystery. Even Congress seemed unaware of it." End quote. Had he wished, Lafayette could have easily purchased better lodgings elsewhere with his own funds. Instead, he chose to remain at camp to share in the struggles of the common soldiers. This served to endear him further to the men, who, by the end of the winter, had begun affectionately referring to him as our Marquis. In a letter he wrote to his wife, Adrienne, dated January 6, 1778, he explained the rationale behind his decision. Quote, "In all sincerity, don't you think that strong reasons have forced me to make these sacrifices? Everyone has been encouraging me to leave, but honor told me to stay. Many foreigners, whose help was turned down and whose ambition was not served, have created powerful intrigues. And, with all sorts of tricks, they have tried to turn me away from this revolution and its leader. Were I to leave, many Frenchmen who are useful here would follow my example. General Washington would be quite unhappy if I told him I was leaving. His trust in me is deeper than I dare say. In the place he occupies, he is surrounded by many flatterers and secret enemies. He finds in me a trustworthy friend in whom he can confide and who will always tell him the truth. Not a day passes where he does not talk to me at length, and he is always willing to consult with me on even the most sensitive of subjects. The abasement of England, service to my homeland, the happiness of humanity whose interest it is to have a completely free country in the world, all these reasons contributed to my not leaving, precisely at the moment when my absence would be the most harmful." End quote. Again, one can infer that this letter was written just as much for his own edification as it was for his family's. As the winter of 1777 to 1778 dragged on, disaffection with Washington's leadership among the American high command continued to mount. Some even called for him to be relieved of his position as commander-in-chief, to be replaced with General Horatio Gates, the victor of the Battle of Saratoga. Washington's most outspoken critic was Major General Thomas Conway. Born in Ireland, Conway had served in the Army of France for most of his career before volunteering to join the Continental Army in 1777. Like many other foreign-born officers, Conway's peers thought him to be brash and arrogant, but by all accounts he was a very competent general. Conway argued that Washington's strategy was too timid, as evidenced by the fact that he had handed over Philadelphia to the enemy without firing a single shot in its defense. Conway was not the only one who harbored such sentiments. Washington's critics also included the former Quartermaster General Thomas Mifflin, Colonel Richard Henry Lee, Congressman Benjamin Rush, and, of course, Horatio Gates, Washington's proposed replacement. Together, this group is referred to as the Conway Cabal. However, the term cabal, I feel, is misleading, as it implies that these critics were more organized and secretive than they were in actuality. The cabal was unsuccessful in their attempts to convince Congress to have Washington relieved of his command, but they were able to induce them to create something called the Board of War, a congressional oversight committee to which the commander-in-chief would be held accountable. The three-man committee was staffed by prominent critics of Washington, with Gates himself appointed as its head. As he indicated in his letter on January 6th, Lafayette was manifestly offended by these attacks against his idol. On hearing of these developments, he composed a letter to Washington informing him of the ongoing intrigue and expressing the indignation that he felt on his behalf. The reason why Lafayette put these words down in writing instead of speaking to Washington directly was, he claimed, that he was too preoccupied at the moment, but at least one biographer has suggested that perhaps Lafayette's command of the English language was not yet at a point where he felt confident enough to express these thoughts out loud. Quote, "There is open dissension in Congress, parties who hate one another as much as the common enemy, stupid men who, without knowing a single word about war, undertake to judge you, to make ridiculous comparisons. They are infatuated with Gates, without thinking of the circumstances, and believe that attacking is the only thing necessary to conquer. Those ideas are entertained in their minds by jealous men, perhaps secret friends to the British government, who want to push you into a moment of ill humor or some rash enterprise against a much stronger army." End quote. He concluded by reaffirming his absolute loyalty to the commander-in-chief. Quote, "I am now fixed to your fate, and I shall follow it and sustain it by my sword and by all means in my power." End quote. Washington was, of course, already well aware of this situation, but still greatly appreciated Lafayette's pledge of fealty, writing in his response, quote, "My dear Marquis, your favor yesterday conveyed to me fresh proof of that friendship and attachment which I have happily expressed since the first of our acquaintance, and for which I entertain the sentiments of purest affection. It will ever constitute part of my happiness to know that I stand well in your opinion, because I am satisfied that you have no views to answer by throwing out false colors, and that you possess a mind too exalted to condescend to low arts and intrigues to acquire such a reputation. I have no doubt that everything happens for the best, that we shall triumph over all our misfortunes, and shall in the end ultimately be happy, my dear Marquis. If you will give me your company in Virginia, we will laugh at our past difficulties and at the folly of others." End quote. It was during his time in Valley Forge that Lafayette began to cultivate two new friendships that would become very important to him, one with John Laurens and the other with Alexander Hamilton. Thanks to a certain musical production that shall not be named, the basic outlines of Hamilton's biography have become quite well known in recent years, but for those unfamiliar, Alexander Hamilton was born in the British colony of Nevis, a small island in the Caribbean. Much like Lafayette, Hamilton was orphaned at a young age. He never got to know his father, who abandoned his family shortly after he was born, and his mother died when he was 10 or 12 years old. Whereas Lafayette had stumbled into immense wealth and was kindly taken in by his parents-in-law, the orphaned Hamilton was left destitute. He was able to attend King's College in New York City, thanks to the help of a local benefactor, and when the Revolutionary War broke out, Hamilton enlisted in an artillery regiment of the Continental Army. He distinguished himself amidst the chaos of the New York and New Jersey campaigns of 1776, and by the time that Lafayette arrived in America the following year, Hamilton had earned a position as Washington's personal secretary and as his unofficial chief of staff. At Valley Forge, Hamilton and Lafayette became fast friends, and it is not hard to see why. They shared much in common. They were both quite young, 20 years old to be precise. Both possessed a strong moral compass and an ardent desire to prove themselves to the world. Then there was John Laurens, the son of Lafayette's friend Henry Laurens, the congressman from South Carolina who was at that time serving as president of Congress. Despite the fact that his father was one of the largest slaveholders in America, the younger Laurens, owing to the liberal education he received in Europe, had become an ardent abolitionist. John Laurens' abolitionist beliefs make him somewhat unique among other figures in American Revolutionary history. Many leaders of the Revolution, like Laurens' own father, for instance, owned slaves. Many others did not, but were ambivalent on the issue. Laurens, on the other hand, was a strong believer in the cause of liberty and the rights of man. It was his hope that, once independence from Great Britain had been achieved, that the underlying contradictions of the American Revolution could be resolved. Anyway, Laurens answered the call to arms and left England, where he was attending college, for America, around the same time that Lafayette departed France. Like Lafayette, Laurens demonstrated an eagerness to prove his bravery on the battlefield. During the Battle of Brandywine, he exhibited an almost suicidal sort of courage that even Lafayette found to be a bit extreme. After the Battle of Germantown in October, Laurens joined General Washington's staff as an aide-de-camp. During the winter at Valley Forge, Lafayette, Hamilton, and Laurens, all of whom shared in common their youthful exuberance and ambition to prove their worth to the cause, forged a strong bond. Hamilton's son later referred to this trio as the Three Musketeers. Something else that united these three musketeers was their great admiration for George Washington. At a time when Washington was facing severe criticism from Conway and other malcontents, they organized a letter-writing campaign to defend him before Congress. Lafayette's letter, almost theatrical in its tone, reads in part, quote, "We have at our head a great judge, a man in whom America, and principally the army, is to have a confidence as extended as the love that he derives from them, and when he will think it proper to fight, I shall believe always that we have good reason for it." Which marches, which movements, what has he done to compare him to the hero who, at the head of 1,600 peasants, pursued last winter by a strong and disciplined army through open country, to that great general who was born for the salvation of his country and the universe? Yes, sir, that very same campaign of last winter would be one of the finest parts of the life of Caesar, Condé, Turenne, and all those men whose name any soldier cannot pronounce without an enthusiastic admiration. End quote. Further on in this document, Lafayette even went so far as to threaten Congress, albeit in an oblique way, that relieving Washington of his command would cause a diplomatic break with France. Lafayette's friend and former traveling companion, the Baron de Kalb, also wrote to Congress vouching for Washington's character and ability, albeit in a more understated manner. Quote, "I think him to be the only proper person, by his natural and acquired capacity, his bravery, good sense, uprightness, and honesty, to keep the spirits of the army and the people. I look upon him as the sole defender of this country's cause." End quote. De Kalb's testimony on Washington's behalf is noteworthy because when he first traveled to America in 1777, he had done so with instructions from his benefactor, the Comte de Broglie, to arrange for the commander-in-chief to be replaced by a French generalissimo, whether that was to be himself or someone else. Concrete information on what some historians refer to as the Broglie intrigue is quite sparse, and in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter all that much since the plan was never put into action. By this time, de Kalb judged it impossible to proceed with the scheme, stating in a letter to Broglie, quote, "It would be regarded as no less an act of crying injustice against Washington than as an outrage on the honor of the whole country." End quote. The fact that de Kalb was now actively trying to prevent Washington from being deposed is, I think, a testament to the respect that he was capable of inspiring in people, despite his detractors. Speaking of those detractors, the Conway cabal continued throughout the winter to find new ways to undermine Washington's authority. In January, Gates, in his capacity as the head of the Board of War, asked Congress to authorize an invasion of Canada, and proposed that Lafayette be placed in charge of the operation. Canada and the 13 colonies were governed under different colonial administrations, and therefore Canada had not been subject to the same laws that had driven the 13 colonies into open rebellion. Nonetheless, the leaders of the American Revolution believed that it was in their interests, both strategic and ideological, that Canada follow them in breaking away from Great Britain and join their nascent union. Now, it must be remembered that most of the territory of what is now eastern Canada, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and eastern Ontario, was initially colonized by France. And although this territory came under British rule in 1763 as a result of their victory in the 7 Years' War, the population remained overwhelmingly French. According to Jonathan Israel in The Expanding Blaze, the population of Canada as of 1770 stood somewhere between 90,000 and 100,000. It is estimated that 80% of the population was of French origin. Many within the revolutionary leadership thought it would be a simple matter to incite the inhabitants of Canada to rebellion, given their traditional antagonism towards Great Britain. In 1774, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which, among other things, guaranteed freedom of worship to Catholics and restored the French civil law code. This had the effect of largely placating the French population of Canada. When the war broke out a year later, Canada became a destination for American loyalists fleeing from the South, a development that only served to make the population all the more immune to America's appeals to revolution. In June 1775, just after the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, an expeditionary force of 1,700 under General Richard Montgomery made its way north, and after a prolonged siege of Fort St. Jean, was able to occupy Montreal by November. A second force under Benedict Arnold joined Montgomery's in December, and together they assaulted Quebec City on the 31st. The Americans were defeated. They suffered heavy losses, and General Montgomery was among those killed in action. Arnold was wounded, and he withdrew with what troops remained to Montreal. They remained there for months afterwards, awaiting reinforcements from the south that finally arrived in June. However, the American forces, weakened by ongoing logistical difficulties and a smallpox epidemic, were defeated again by the British at Trois-Rivières, and the expedition was ultimately called off. Despite this failure, it was still widely believed that Canada could be persuaded to join the revolutionary fold eventually, if only a decisive blow could be struck against Britain's hold over it. But when Conway and Gates proposed a new incursion into Canada in January 1778, they were well aware that such an undertaking, especially in the dead of winter, was ill-advised, practically certain to fail, but these two had ulterior motives. By nominating Lafayette to lead such a doomed effort, the pair hoped to pry the Marquis away from Valley Forge and separate Washington from one of his most outspoken defenders. In the very likely event that he failed, Lafayette would be humiliated, perhaps even driven to return home. Conway and Gates cleverly pitched their plan to Congress, assuring them that were Lafayette successful to rescue Quebec from the clutches of Britain, that a formal alliance with France was all but assured. Congress readily agreed. Lafayette was duly appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Northern Army of the United States, with Thomas Conway as his second-in-command. Lafayette correctly sensed that something was awry, and he wrote to Congress telling them that he was willing to accept the assignment, but only under two conditions. Firstly, he would not accept the status of Commander-in-Chief, as it would give him a rank equal to Washington and make him effectively independent of his authority. Moreover, he refused to allow Conway to serve as his second-in-command. Quote, "How can I support the society of a man who has spoken of my friend in the most insolent and abusive terms, who has done and does every day all that is in his power to ruin him?" End quote. Ever worried about potentially alienating Lafayette and the French government by extension, Congress relented. Instead of Conway, Lafayette appointed the Baron de Kalb as his second-in-command, and replaced the rest of the staff, all of whom were critics of Washington, with men of his own selection, including his two aides-de-camp, Gimat and La Colombe. These developments notwithstanding, General Gates invited Lafayette to a dinner to celebrate his new commission. Here, in the presence of Gates and other prominent critics of Washington, Lafayette proposed a toast to the Commander-in-Chief, and he relished the sight of these men begrudgingly raising their glasses in Washington's honor, their faces red with embarrassment. After stopping briefly in Congress's temporary headquarters in the town of York, Pennsylvania, to receive his marching orders, Lafayette set out for Albany, New York, on February 3, 1778. In the written orders from Congress, Lafayette's expedition was characterized as a, quote, interruption into Canada, end quote. His official mission was twofold. Upon reaching Montreal, Lafayette was to incite the Canadians to join the United States. In the event that the Canadians were not so inclined, his secondary mission was to destroy all British ships and military installations that he possibly could before returning to Saratoga. In a letter he wrote to Adrienne the day that he set out for Albany, Lafayette expressed conflicting emotions about his upcoming campaign. On one hand, he relished the idea of, quote, liberating New France and delivering her from a heavy yoke, end quote. On the other hand, he harbored serious doubts as to his ability to carry out the mission assigned to him. Quote, "I am undertaking a terrifying task. At 20, one is not prepared to be at the head of an army, responsible for all the numberless details that devolve upon a general, and having under my direct orders such a great expanse of country." End quote. In the end, all of his concerns amounted to nothing. Arriving in Albany on February 17th, Lafayette discovered a disastrous state of affairs. The Board of War had promised Lafayette an army of 2,500 men, along with the requisite weapons, ammunition, foodstuffs, and other necessities. In reality, there were only 1,200 men in Albany, most of whom were just as poorly supplied as the men back in Valley Forge. Not knowing whether incompetence or treachery was to blame for the situation in which he now found himself, Lafayette sought out the advice of the man who would help lead the first incursion into Canada, General Benedict Arnold. Arnold happened to be in Albany at that moment, still recovering from wounds he suffered during the Battle of Saratoga. He told Lafayette rather bluntly that to undertake the expedition now, given the state of the army, would be suicidal. 2 days later, Lafayette reported to Congress that he was unable to carry out the mission under the current circumstances and asked for new orders. Furious and feeling personally humiliated, Lafayette dashed off an angry letter to Henry Laurens on February 19th, quote, How shall I describe this hell of blunders, madness, and deception that I am involved in? My situation is such that I am reduced to wish that I had never set foot in America. The world has their eyes fixed on me. Men will have the right to laugh at me. I'll almost feel ashamed to appear before some." End quote. He also expressed these feelings to Washington, writing, quote, "What business had the Board of War to hurry me through the ice and snow without knowing what I should do, nor what they were doing themselves? Your Excellency may judge that I am very distressed by this disappointment. My being appointed to the command of this expedition is known throughout the continent, and soon it will be known in Europe. I am afraid that it will reflect on my reputation, and that I shall be laughed at." End quote. Washington did his best to calm Lafayette, reassuring him that he was not to blame for this debacle, saying, quote, "I hasten to dispel those fears regarding your reputation, which are excited only by an uncommon degree of sensibility. You seem to apprehend that censure, proportioned to the disappointed expectations of the world, will fall on you in consequences of the failure of the Canadian expedition. But in the first place, it will be no advantage to you to have it known in Europe that you receive so manifest a proof of the good opinion and confidence of Congress as an important detached command, and I am persuaded that everyone will applaud you for your prudence in renouncing a project that, in pursuing which, you would have vainly attempted physical impossibilities. However sensibly your ardor for glory may make you feel this disappointment, you may rest assured that your character stands as fair as it ever did." End quote. Lafayette would recover from this embarrassment in due time, but he would continue to entertain the notion of conquering Canada right up until the final moments of the war. Lafayette remained in Albany for nearly a month as he awaited new orders from Congress. He received them by March. They formally called off the Canadian expedition and passed a resolution commending him for dealing with this whole affair in a dignified manner. His new instructions were to travel nearly 50 miles to the northwest to the settlement of Johnstown in order to meet with representatives of the Iroquois Confederacy in the hopes of securing their allegiance in the ongoing war. The Iroquois, often erroneously referred to as a tribe, were in actuality a confederacy of tribes made up of 5 constituent nations native to what is now upstate New York: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. More recently, the Tuscarora, originally native to North Carolina, had been admitted to the Confederacy, hence why the Iroquois were often referred to in contemporary sources as the Six Nations. As a regional power, the Iroquois had been involved in the various North American colonial wars between France and Britain, often playing both sides against each other in order to advance their interests and maintain their independence. When the continent descended into war once again in 1775, the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy adopted a policy of neutrality, but, given their proximity to the conflict, this stance would prove untenable, and the Six Nations sided almost uniformly with the British Crown, with only the Oneida tribe remaining neutral. American observers were confounded by the decision of the Iroquois to stand against them. In their perception, the Native Americans were a freedom-loving people, who cherished the very same ideals that the Patriots claimed to stand for. Most Americans reasoned that the Iroquois had sided with the British because they were being bribed, and, while this might have been true to an extent, when it came to this conflict, the Iroquois' considerations went far deeper than the promises of land and wealth made by British colonial officials. It is true that their relationship with the British Crown had been at times antagonistic, but it was the American colonists, with their ever-present compulsion to expand westward, thereby encroaching on their territory, who appeared to constitute the greater threat to their sovereignty. The Six Nations were not alone in reasoning that the British were the lesser of two evils in this conflict. In fact, far more Native Americans, nearly 13,000 of them, fought alongside the British in the course of the war. Those who chose to throw in their lot with the British understood the British Crown to be a restraint on the territorial ambitions of the colonists, a reality that was every bit apparent to them as it was to the Americans themselves. The Quebec Act, which was passed by the Parliament in London, restricted American settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and was considered to be one of the so-called intolerable acts, the passage of which was an immediate catalyst for the Revolution. Nonetheless, many Americans still believed that the Native Americans could still be won over to their cause if they were able to appeal to their love of liberty and freedom. It was to that end that Congress dispatched Lafayette to negotiate with the 6 tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy. In particular, Lafayette was chosen for this mission on account of the fact that the Iroquois were previously known to have enjoyed close relations with the French. And so Lafayette set out to meet with the Iroquois delegation, fully convinced of the American point of view, and with no inkling that the conflict between them and the Americans may well have been irreconcilable as things stood. Lafayette described in vivid detail the sight that awaited him upon reaching the meeting place in Johnstown. Quote, 500 men, women, and children attended the convention, streaked with multicolored paint and feathers, their ears cut open, jewels dangling from their noses, their half-naked bodies tattooed and painted with a variety of designs. The old men smoked and talked about their politics quite intelligently. When the drunkenness of rum did not distract them, their goal was a balance of power. End quote. After a few days of eating, drinking, smoking, and fraternizing with the Iroquois delegates, Lafayette took his leave and was given orders to return to Valley Forge. Lafayette had enjoyed the most success with the Oneida, the Confederacy's only tribe that had elected to remain neutral. They took a liking to the Frenchman, and even ceremonially adopted him into their tribe under the name Kewella, meaning fearsome horseman. A band of 50 Oneida warriors agreed to join the Continental Army come spring, but ultimately this diplomatic effort fell short of its goal. None of the Six Nations formally agreed to join the American cause. Upon returning to Valley Forge in late March 1778, he was pleasantly surprised to find the army in a much better state than he had left it. To be sure, the men had continued to suffer over the past months. The fortunes of the army reached their lowest ebb in February. Scores of men died from malnutrition, disease, and exposure, even more deserted. Logistical issues continued to plague the camp until early March, when the incompetent Quartermaster General Thomas Mifflin resigned from office after having been accused of embezzlement. Washington loyalist Nathaniel Greene was appointed to replace him. Once in office, Greene went to great lengths to ensure that the army at Valley Forge had adequate provisions. Needless to say, this led to a great improvement of morale. Another factor which served to improve the state of the army at Valley Forge was the arrival of Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Steuben was another European army officer who had arrived in America bearing letters of recommendation from Congress's representatives abroad, Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin. These letters claimed that Steuben was a Prussian general who had served under King Frederick II, who would later be known as the Great for his military exploits. And like many of those who preceded him, for instance, the Baron de Kalb, von Steuben had purposely misrepresented his credentials to the Americans. For one, he was never a general. During his service in the Prussian army, he rose only as high as the rank of captain, and while he had, in fact, served under Frederick the Great, it had been as an aide-de-camp and not as a field commander as he had claimed. For whatever it was worth, von Steuben did actually hold the title of Baron, though he acquired it later in life. More to the point, though, von Steuben had, during his 18 years of service in the Prussian army, acquired a vast and detailed knowledge of training and drilling methods for which the Prussian army was famous. This fearsome reputation had preceded him, and he made quite the impression on the Americans upon arriving in Valley Forge on the 23rd of February. One soldier later recalled, quote, "I thought of him as the ancient fabled god of war. He appeared to me to be a perfect personalization of Mars. The trappings of his horse, the enormous holsters of his pistols, and his large size, and his strikingly martial aspect all seemed to favor this idea." End quote. Washington appointed von Steuben as the Inspector General of the Army, entrusting him with, among other things, enforcing some semblance of discipline on the soldiers. Von Steuben, who was accustomed to the legendary discipline of the Prussian military, was aghast at the state of the American army. For one, the Continental Army, unlike its Prussian counterpart, was a volunteer force. Few among them had any prior military experience. Time and again, their performance in combat had been disappointing. The fact that the Americans still had an army to speak of was practically a miracle in itself. Von Steuben was particularly appalled to discover that the soldiers could hardly even march in a proper line. The Baron had his work cut out for him, to say the very least, but the fact that he was not able to speak English did complicate matters. Instead, when drilling the soldiers, he barked out orders in his native German, tasking his secretary, Pierre-Etienne de Ponceau, with translating. After some time, von Steuben realized that in many ways, the army of a republic like the United States could not function in the same way as the army of an absolute monarchy, like that of Prussia. As he would later write, quote, "In Prussia, one tells a soldier to do something, and he does it. In America, one must first explain why, and then he will do it." End quote. Instead of trying to enforce a harsh, Prussian-style brand of discipline, von Steuben showed remarkable patience with the men and, what's more, appeared to exhibit a concern for their well-being. Both qualities served to endear him to the rank-and-file soldiers, and aided greatly in his effort to transform the Continental Army into a more disciplined fighting force capable of contending with the British. Von Steuben became acquainted with Lafayette after he returned to Valley Forge from Albany, and Lafayette assisted the Baron in translating a training manual from French into English. This training manual was officially entitled Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, but was more commonly referred to as simply the Blue Book. It would serve as the official handbook of the United States Army until the War of 1812. As the infamous winter of 1777 to 1778 gave way to spring, things seemed to be looking up for the Americans. Thanks to the efforts of Greene, von Steuben, and others, the Continental Army was poised to emerge from their encampment in a better state than they had been when they entered it. On the 1st of May, Simeon Dean, the younger brother of Silas Dean, rode into Valley Forge bearing important news from Paris. The Kingdom of France had officially signed 2 treaties with the United States of America. Quote, "We now have the great satisfaction of acquainting with you and with Congress that the treaties with France are at length completed and signed. The first is a treaty of amity and commerce. The other is a treaty of alliance, in which it is stipulated that in case England declares war against France, we should make common cause of it and join our forces. The great aim of this treaty is declared to be to establish the liberty, sovereignty, and independence, absolute and unlimited, of the United States. The preparations for war in France are carried on with immense activity, and it is soon expected." End quote. Both of these treaties had officially been signed on February 6th, but the news had naturally taken quite some time to make it across the Atlantic. Once it did, it was received at Valley Forge with a spontaneous and euphoric celebration. Cannons fired salvos into the sky in salutation of King Louis XVI. The occasion was commemorated by singing, dancing, parades, feasting, and copious alcohol consumption. Lafayette's personal reaction to the news was rather fitting with his character. He was overcome with emotion, broke down in tears of joy, and suddenly embraced Washington and kissed him on both cheeks, a display which caught everyone, especially Washington himself, by surprise. Everyone present understood the significant ramifications these treaties would have. In a letter to Washington, Pennsylvania Congressman Robert Morris boldly claimed that, quote, "Our independence is undoubtedly secured. Our country must be free." End quote. Writing to Henry Laurens, Lafayette said, quote, "I am myself fit to receive as well as to offer congratulations in this happy circumstance. If you remember, sir, in which moment, in which sentiment I left my country, you will easily conceive how surprised and pleased I must be to see our noble cause arise at such a period of glory and success. I send you my wishes for the happiness of mankind, for the prosperity and freedom and the glory of what they call in France, my new country, America." End quote. Lafayette's elation at this piece of news from France would very soon be tamped down by another. It was at this time that he finally learned of the death of his infant daughter, Henriette, in October of the previous year. For the past 7 months, Lafayette had written letters to his wife Adrienne, asking her to kiss their daughter for him, content in the belief that he would be reunited with her and the rest of his family upon returning home. While everyone around him engaged in the revelry of the day, Lafayette refused to detract from the joy of the moment, doing his best to keep up a joyful facade. He donned a white scarf, a symbol of France's ruling dynasty, the Bourbons, and led a group of fellow Frenchmen in a march on the parade grounds. Later that night, after he retired from the festivities, he immediately penned a letter to Adrienne, quote, "How horrible is our separation! I never before felt the cruelty of it so deeply. My heart suffers doubly, from my own sorrow and from my inability to share in yours. The time it has taken before I learned of it has also increased my misery. The loss of our poor child is always on my mind. The news came right after the news of the treaty, and with my heart torn by pain, I had to participate in the public joy." End quote. A group of people who were not at all joyful about this news were the British. The Franco-American alliance was an unwelcome development, to say the very least. On March 17th, Great Britain formally broke relations with the Kingdom of France and declared war shortly after. The next month, King George III recalled William Howe, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in North America, back to England. Howe was not a bad general by any means. In fact, he had remained undefeated in the field. He was the one who presided over the British victories at Brandywine and Germantown, which had enabled the British to occupy the enemy capital. But despite all his successes, he failed to destroy the rebel army completely. His responsibility for the British defeat at Saratoga is a matter of historical debate, but he took responsibility for it regardless. After the battle, he dispatched a letter to London requesting to resign from his post, a request that was finally granted the following April. His replacement as commander-in-chief was Henry Clinton, a 48-year-old veteran of the 7 Years' War, who had been fighting against the Americans since the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. Realizing the precarity of the military situation, Clinton sought to pursue a different strategy than his predecessor. With the prospect of French intervention now inevitable, Clinton decided to abandon Philadelphia and to concentrate his forces in the more defensible position of New York City. Throughout the month of May, as Clinton prepared to evacuate Philadelphia, the outgoing General Howe hosted a series of legendary festivities in the city that ran up a massive bill, in excess of $600,000 in today's currency. All this activity in Philadelphia had tipped off the Americans to the fact that the British were now preparing for something, but for what, it was not clear. In order to better understand what the enemy was up to, Washington sent out a small detachment of soldiers to reconnoiter the city's environs. He entrusted Lafayette with this delicate mission. The aborted Canadian expedition notwithstanding, this was to be his first major independent command, and as such, Washington issued him very precise instructions. Quote, "This will be a matter of no small difficulty, and will require the greatest amount of caution and prudence in its execution. Remember that your detachment is a very valuable one, and that any accident happening to it would be a very severe blow to this army. No attempt should be made, nor anything risked, without the greatest prospect of success, and with every reasonable advantage." End quote. In particular, Washington was adamant that Lafayette himself should do his utmost to remain out of harm's way, not in the least because an untimely death was certain to put a damper on the new alliance with France. On May 18, 1778, Lafayette set out from Valley Forge at the head of 2,200 soldiers. Among them were the 50 Oneida warriors who had previously promised to join him in February. Lafayette traveled about half the distance between Valley Forge and Philadelphia and set up a temporary camp at a place called Barren Hill. In his orders, Washington had specifically instructed Lafayette to avoid staying in one area for too long, but Lafayette ignored this order, and it very nearly cost him everything. From his encampment, Lafayette sent spies into the city to gain more intel on British troop movements. One of these spies turned out to be a double agent, who informed General Howe of the location of Lafayette's force. For Howe, who was about to return to London in disgrace, the prospect of defeating and capturing Lafayette and returning with the Marquis as a prisoner was simply too tantalizing of an opportunity to resist. Howe immediately put the ongoing festivities on hold and rallied his troops to march to Barren Hill. In the early hours of the morning of May 20th, Lafayette's 2,200-man force was surrounded by a British army more than 4 times its size. Luckily, one of his lookouts was able to spot the British vanguard and alerted Lafayette in the nick of time. Springing out of bed, he immediately began to organize a retreat. He had one unit open fire on the advancing British column to create the impression that he was preparing to stay and fight, while he led the rest of his men along a back road, across the river, and back into Valley Forge. Ultimately, Lafayette's men suffered only 3 casualties. The British trudged back to Philadelphia, humiliated and with nothing to show for the day's efforts. Howe had been disgraced one final time before boarding the ship that would take him back to England, where he faced possible censure for his failures in North America. Meanwhile, a fatigued Lafayette returned to Valley Forge, his detachment still intact. Although it was his disregard for Washington's orders that very nearly led to the catastrophe, he was not reprimanded. Seeking to spare the Marquis's feelings, Washington wrote the following in his report of the Battle of Barren Hill, quote, "The Marquis had nearly been caught in a snare. In fact, he was in it, but by his own dexterity, or by the enemy's want of it, he disengaged himself by an orderly and well-conducted retreat. On the whole, he made handsomely off." End quote. By June 18th, General Clinton ordered the complete evacuation of Philadelphia. He was able to send 3,000 soldiers to New York City by ship, but the rest of his army, about 17,000 men, had no choice but to make the nearly 100-mile-long march overland through New Jersey. Taking with them everything of value from the city, the British Army's baggage train stretched out for 12 miles. To Washington, the British Army appeared to be in a supremely vulnerable position. He reasoned that now was the time to strike. The very next day, the order came down to break camp and head out. In spite of the hardships that it had endured through the previous winter, the Continental Army had emerged from its ordeal just as strong as ever. A rush of new recruits joined in the spring, swelling the Army's ranks to 13,000 men. Thanks to the constant training and drilling overseen by Baron von Steuben, all of these men, veterans and new recruits alike, were prepared for battle, and they seemed quite eager for a fight. An exception to this was General Charles Lee, who had rejoined the army the previous month. Lee was born in England in February 1731, making him as old as Washington. He had served with the British in the 7 Years' War. In fact, both he and Washington served under the same superior officer during that conflict, Major General Edward Braddock, and both had been present at the Battle of Monongahela, in which Braddock was killed in action. After the war's conclusion, Lee returned to Europe where he offered his service to other European powers, before returning to America in 1773 and purchasing an estate in Virginia. Upon the outbreak of war, Lee immediately volunteered for the Continental Army. Across contemporary sources, a portrait of Lee emerges as an individual who demonstrated a number of antisocial personality traits. He was misanthropic, egotistic, and had a short temper. Lee believed himself to be more qualified to lead the Continental Army, and while he still agreed to serve under Washington, it seems that he was never able to fully accept his authority over him. The relationship between Lee and Washington remained tense but cordial until the New York and New Jersey campaign of 1776, during which time Lee's flagrant disregard for Washington's orders had led to his capture by the British in December. Lee was freed during a prisoner exchange and returned to active duty in May 1778. Although he was often a thorn in his side, Washington still believed Lee to be one of his more capable generals and respected his advice. During the war councils in which the American officers debated among themselves as to their next move regarding the British convoy leaving Philadelphia, Lee was among those who urged restraint. The British, he argued, may seem vulnerable, but they still outnumbered the Americans. They would not stand a chance if they engaged the British in open battle. Lafayette, on the other hand, was among those advocating more aggressive action. Washington's initial instinct had been to attack, but at the urging of Lee and others, he opted to compromise. He would have the army tail the British at a distance, awaiting an opportunity to strike. The moment seemed to present itself on June 24th. Inclement weather, specifically a heat wave which brought temperatures as high as 90 degrees Fahrenheit, as well as torrential rains and the associated humidity, had slowed the British advance to a crawl. On the 26th, most of the army was encamped near Monmouth, New Jersey, today known as Freehold. If the Americans were going to engage the British before they reached New York, now was their chance. Washington had already sent 2 smaller detachments, each numbering about 1,000, to pursue and harass the British rear guard. That evening, Washington ordered a larger force of 4,000 to catch up with the others and to attack the British at Monmouth. If these initial actions were successful, Washington would bring the remainder of the army to bear upon the British. Washington initially appointed Lee to command the vanguard, but Lee, being opposed to the plan, refused. So the responsibility of commanding these 4,000 men fell to Lafayette, who eagerly accepted and galloped off before anyone could change their minds. It was not long before Lee did in fact change his mind, and urged Washington to allow him to replace Lafayette. What exactly caused this sudden about-face is unclear. Perhaps he realized that the attack was going to happen regardless, and didn't want to miss out for an opportunity to make up for his humiliating capture by the British 2 years prior. Maybe he felt uneasy in trusting the inexperienced Lafayette with such a consequential undertaking. Whatever the case may have been, though, Washington agreed. He ordered Lee to catch up with Lafayette and take over command of the army from him. Lee reached Lafayette and Company the following day as they were setting up camp 5 miles from the British position. The opening shots of the Battle of Monmouth were fired around dawn on the morning of June 28th. By then, the British had long since realized that the Americans had caught up with them and were planning to attack them in the rear, so they were able to reinforce their position. Still, the initiative lay with the Americans, but Lee refused to press his advantage. The American columns remained in place. When Washington sent Lee orders to press the attack, the ensuing advance was disorganized, with the troops moving every which way in an uncoordinated fashion. Sensing that something was amiss behind American lines, the British launched a counterattack, pushing the Americans back and forcing Lee to order a full retreat. Somehow, the initial situation had become completely reversed, with the British now on the offensive. Washington personally went to the front lines to assess the chaotic situation for himself. Finally reaching the man responsible for this state of affairs, Washington verbally berated Lee for his failure. He allegedly let loose on the general a long string of expletives and curses before relieving him of his command. Lafayette later recalled that this was the only time he had heard the usually stoic Washington use such coarse language. Quickly taking over control of the situation, Washington tried to undo the damage that Lee had done. He ordered a halt to the retreat, had the lines reformed, and personally led his men in charging against the British position. Inspired by the courage of their leader, the American soldiers continued to fight ferociously until dusk. Lafayette wrote fawningly of Washington's performance that day, quote, "General Washington was never greater in battle than in that action. His presence stopped the retreat. His strategy secured the victory. His stately appearance on horseback, his calm, dignified courage, tinged only slightly by the anger of the unfortunate incident in the morning, provoked a wave of enthusiasm among the troops." End quote. By nightfall, Washington was physically exhausted and sat down beneath a tree to rest. He invited Lafayette to sit by his side, and the pair awoke the next morning to find that the British had stolen away in the middle of the night, retreating to the north. Tactically speaking, the Battle of Monmouth was a draw. Neither side was able to completely defeat the other, with both sides losing about 300 men each. From a strategic point of view, Monmouth was a victory for the Americans, their first victory in quite some time. They had encountered the British in open battle and forced them to flee the field. Had Lee not ordered the initial retreat that morning, the Americans very well could have trapped and destroyed a significant portion of the British army. This, of course, raises the question, why did Lee do it? What was going through his head at the time? Those inclined to give Lee the benefit of the doubt claim that the debacle at Monmouth was simply caused by miscommunication. Others suggest that Lee intended to purposely throw the battle for some reason or other. It's possible that he was still upset about Washington's choice and thought that by losing the battle, Washington would have to change his strategy. Some even go so far as to claim that Lee was a traitor, an agent in the employ of the British who deliberately tried to concede the battle to them. In any case, Washington had Lee court-martialed in the aftermath of the battle. The charges were, quote, disobedience of orders and not attacking the enemy, misbehavior before the enemy, making an unnecessary, disorderly, and shameful retreat, and disrespect of the commander-in-chief, end quote. Lafayette was one of those who testified against Lee at his trial, and he was ultimately found guilty of all charges and formally relieved of his command for 1 year. He would never serve in the Continental Army again, though. He resigned in disgrace in 1782 and died a short time later. He spent the last 4 years of his life constantly writing letters in which he disparaged his former commander. These eventually prompted John Lawrence to challenge Lee to a duel, in the course of which Lee was non-fatally wounded. And here, I think, is a good place to conclude our narrative for today. In the next episode, we will continue Lafayette's story as he works to facilitate cooperation between his adoptive country and his native country, now that the alliance between France and the United States had been formalized. From the beginning of his adventure, Lafayette had said that he was helping to advance the interests of France by fighting for the cause of America. Now that the two were allies, it seemed as though he had been vindicated. He could credit himself to a degree with bringing this about, but what role would the Marquis play in the Continental Army and in Franco-American relations going forward? You'll have to tune in again in 2 weeks to find out. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything else you'd like me to address, you can email me at perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also reach out to me on Twitter, Facebook, or the show's website, links to all of which will be in this episode's description. If you like the show and would like to help keep it going, I'd encourage you to consider supporting the show financially by purchasing some used books from me on eBay. Link to that site will also be in this episode's description. Also, please consider leaving a review for the show on iTunes or whichever podcast listening platform you prefer. Anyway, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.
Avec le faux l'on connaîtra, le citoyen pour le bien soutiendra. Ça ira. Quand l'aristocrate protestera, le bon citoyen au délirira, sans avoir à le troubler. Toujours le plus fort sera. Ça ira. Le peuple armé toujours se gardera.